The next speaker is Rosa Gomez, the Assistant Chief of Human Resources Branch at the Department of Rehabilitation. So she oversees the performance health management units and the Reasonable Accommodations program. She further serves as the chief consultant and subject matter expert on RA for DOR and other state partners, with a focus on increasing and retaining the representation of people with disabilities. With that, I'll go ahead for the sake of time and move on to Rosa, if you're ready to give your presentation.
Great, thank you. And I just want to do a sound check to make sure I'm coming through okay.
Perfect. Yes, we can hear
Awesome,
you.
thank you. All right, well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's been probably at least a couple months that I was in a meeting with Bobby, and he asked if I would be able to come and present. We were having a discussion, and he thought that it would really be helpful if I could present on the topic of what should employees with disabilities consider when requesting an accommodation. So I'm here to present on this topic with the idea that we have SDAC members from all different departments here, and hoping that I can share some best practices that you're able to take this information back to your department to help support the employees with disabilities within your department. I thought it would be important if we could start off with doing a little kind of level setting to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. Everybody has different experiences and knowledge around reasonable accommodation and the reasonable accommodation process. So just to start off with just a quick definition of what is a reasonable accommodation. So to start off with, a reasonable accommodation affords people with disabilities access to equal employment opportunities and is an important part of fostering a diverse and supportive workplace. The reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment to any aspect of the job or the work environment, including the hiring process, as well as training for people with disabilities to enable them to perform their essential functions of their work. A reasonable accommodation is any change to the application or hiring process, to the job, the way the job is done, or the work environment that allows an applicant or an employee to successfully carry out their essential work functions. Also, just a reminder of types of reasonable accommodations. Rather, there are many types of reasonable accommodations. An employee may need one or several types and accommodations to carry out the essential functions. Each reasonable accommodation request is unique as it's based on what is the individual's functional limitations and what are the accommodations that will be needed to support an employee to carry out their work. So reasonable accommodations can include assistive technology, job coach, changes in supervisory techniques, American Sign Language, or modifications to schedules. It's also important to know that eliminating an essential work function does not fall under the reasonable accommodation program. Transferring to a new supervisor is not considered part of the reasonable accommodation. Also, the commute to and from work does not fall under the reasonable accommodation. And there are some employers that may provide commute accommodations, but an employer is not required to provide an accommodation for a commute. Also, it should be important to know that accommodations to allow for an individual to care for a family member with a disability does also not fall under the reasonable accommodation program. So just some basic information. So providing the definition of a disability is also important. So I'll just share that a little bit. A disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. An applicant or employee does not need to disclose to their employer what their disability is or the diagnosis. However, for an employee to be protected, they do need to share that they are a person with a disability and that they need a reasonable accommodation. So essential functions, because we talked a little bit about what are essential functions, so important to kind of level set what an essential function is. So the essential functions are the basic jobs, duties that an employee is required to perform. So it's the reason why the position exists and why the individual was hired to serve in their position to carry out those work tasks associated with their job. And a qualified individual is defined as a person who is able to perform their essential functions with or without a reasonable accommodation. So we're going to talk a little bit about the reasonable accommodation process. And to say that I'm going to give you kind of some steps, some general steps, but know that, it's very fluid, that things can change. Processes may, or the different steps may, kind of ebb and flow depending on, if accommodations are working, if we need to have additional conversations. So I just want to give some kind of a general basic understanding. So the first part is, again, requesting a reasonable accommodation. So again, employees do not need to share what their diagnosis or the disability, but they do need to inform their employer they are a person with a disability and need a accommodation. So also, an individual can have somebody request a reasonable accommodation on their behalf. And examples of how this is often seen is that an employee can provide a medical note that requests a specific accommodation. So a medical note may provide information about what accommodation that the employee is requesting. And just pause a little bit, which is very different from process can be initiated either by the employer or the employee and involves discussions. And there may be multiple discussions that take place to work to understand what is the reasonable accommodation needs, what are the limitations, and how to best support an employee to carry out their essential functions. Let's see, an employee can bring someone to support them during the interactive discussion, and that's really important. Sometimes it's beneficial to have somebody to ask clarifying questions, to be able to represent what the limitations are, and to help provide the support during the reasonable accommodation process. So I think it's important that employees are aware they can have support from somebody outside of it just being the employer. There may be times when medical information is being requested. And when requesting the medical information, there will not be an ask for the diagnosis or identifying what the disability is. The focus in obtaining a medical note is to identify what are the functional limitations to assist with identifying how we can implement and what those reasonable accommodations will be put in place to support the individual. Oftentimes this may be done if there is a reasonable accommodation request that has been made, but it is unclear as to what are the limitations. So the employer may request additional information to understand the limitations or to understand the accommodation that is being requested. So when a medical note is submitted, it is important for the medical provider to identify the functional limitations or the work restrictions. And then also that the medical note should support the limitations and the requested accommodation should be supported by the medical note. It's also important to share that when a medical provider submits a medical note on behalf of the employee, that the provider should be qualified to make the recommendation. So the example I like to use is that a chiropractor would not be appropriate to recommend an emotional support animal for an individual with a mental health limitation. So I did hear in the chat, and I'm just going to quickly, I'm not able to hear all the chats as they come through, but yes, a union representative can be an individual that an employee requests, reaches out to the union and asks if they can be a part of the interactive process, and they can have a union rep there. Once all information has been obtained, so additional medical information, engaging in the interactive process, the next step is to be able to take the information, have conversations, and share what what can be implemented. And so again, remembering that each reasonable accommodation is unique and individualized. Many reasonable accommodations do not require purchases and can be easily to make adjustments to the, for example, a schedule change. So there may be some reasonable accommodations that do take a little bit more time because we need to make a purchase. And when making purchases in a state service, we have to follow the procurement process. So if we are making purchases and it does take time, one of the things that's important to note is that interim accommodations can be provided. An example would be, for example, if we have an individual who it has been determined that a support service assistant would best meet their needs, but it takes time to hire an SSA, then we can look to see, for example, if a colleague may be able to help with reading information or bringing consumers, in our case, bringing in information or the consumers to the employee so that the employee does not need to walk around to either meet with an individual or to get documents and so forth. In some instances, there are reasonable accommodations that are long-term accommodations, and there's some accommodations depending on what the needs may be short-term. And when the employee has all the identified accommodations in place and they are meeting the ability to perform their essential functions, and the employee has identified that the accommodations are working, then we would consider this request closed. However, it's important to know that there may be changes in an individual's disability status. There may be some changes that requires that there are new accommodations needed, or modifications to the accommodations, and additional conversations can take place so that we are able to identify alternative accommodations to support the individual should there be those changes. And then in the same situation that, again, if there's maybe changes to business operational needs, then an employer will need to connect with the employee to share that there are some changes that we need to look at the existing accommodations and identify alternative accommodations to support an individual. It's important also to remember that an employer is not required to eliminate an essential job function or to lower quality or quantity standards. And then if there has been some essential functions that have been eliminated, perfect example that we all went through with COVID, and there were changes to how departments performed work, that the employer does have the right to restore essential jobs functions that may have been eliminated previously. And let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about, because this comes up a lot, the statement that my accommodation has been denied versus identifying alternative accommodations. I can say for our department that if an individual has been denied an accommodation, then this would mean that an individual, after reviewing information, it has been determined that the individual does not have a disability. And I can share that when that has happened, we will talk with the employee about, though this doesn't fall under the Reasonable Accommodation program, here are some alternative programs and considerations that can support you to address the concerns that they're raising. If the requested accommodation cannot be supported because it does not meet the business operational needs, then there will be a discussion to share that the specific accommodation cannot be provided. However, we need to identify alternative accommodations. And then interactive discussions will take place to, again, look at the limitations, to review various types of accommodation, and to identify what can be put in place. Let's see. So again, just that the big part of being able to identify the alternative accommodations is going back and engaging in the interactive process, and to ensure that the employee has identified alternative accommodations, and we'll continue the process till the accommodations have been identified. And there is the recognition that that if a requested accommodation has not been able to be supported and an alternative accommodation has been identified, that an employee may not be satisfied with this decision. And employees do have the right to appeal the decision. So this is done after a decision has been made regarding the requested accommodation. And then the employee can request to have, or request an appeal if they are not in agreement with the identified accommodations. And I know there's a lot of questions that have come in the chat, and I wasn't able to hear all of them. I'm a JAWS user, so I wasn't able to hear all of them, and I'm kind of muting because it is very distracting to try and keep my place and thoughts. And so let's open it up for some questions. And
thank you, Rosa.
Stay for a short time.
Presentation, and I appreciate that you went ahead and started answering some questions on the fly. from the chat box. So with that, let's, I guess, officially go into the post-presentation question and answer session. Before we go to the audience for additional questions, I was hoping to ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
The first one is, as part of your, and I know that your presentation was about reasonable accommodation, but reasonable accommodation is likely part of the workforce analysis and the disability culture of an agency. So I'm wondering, do you have metrics that your agency tracks specifically on overall disability culture?
Can you elaborate more and explain what you're looking for? I'm not
I'm just trying to
understand
see
your
if
words, but just
the Department of Rehabilitation's tracks data on any trends as far as disability goes and the policies and how the people with disabilities employed by DOR are impacted or not impacted, and just to see culture shifts of the agency as it goes on.
that's not something I work on, and that may be something from a different section.
Okay.
We do, our parity rate is very high, and we do have a lot of reasonable accommodation requests. So my focus is really on engaging with employees, engaging with managers, and that is not the focus of the work that I do.
Okay, no, I appreciate your thoughts on it. And then also reiterating, great presentation, liked it a lot, and I think it was really informative. The next question I have is with regards to accommodations. Do you have a sense of what percentage of DOR's workforce was granted remote work as an RA prior to 2020, and how that figure has shifted since that time, including in response to Executive Order N22-25, which mentions RA, and what trends are you seeing now?
Thank you. Yeah, so I have not been providing reasonable accommodations prior to the pandemic, kind of came in at the tail end. So I don't have prior trends. We have not collected that data. I know that, during the pandemic, we certainly did see more trends. I think it has shifted. I don't have statistics I can provide to you, but it all depends on the individual. It's not that, people aren't requesting specific types of accommodations, but everybody's needs are unique. So it all depends on what an individual's limitations are. So I can't, again, speak to, what are the numbers. We look at what are the limitations, what are the work essential functions that we need to address, and then how we can put that in place. So I know that has been asked, and just at this time, we don't have that data. So.
Mhm.
Thank
Okay.
you so much for that response. Let's go to President of AXME. He has his hand raised for a while. He gets tired. We'll get to him. Go ahead, unmute, ask your question.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, so during your presentation, you mentioned two things, and you continue to mention them. One is essential job duties, and two, you mentioned quantity requirements. And so I would like you to elaborate on the essential job duties of a DOR counselor, requiring them to be in office if that's an essential job duty, and then what exactly is a quantity requirement?
Great questions. So I'm going to speak to, you mentioned counselors, and I'm a former counselor, so, been a part of the union in the past. So in terms of in-office work, our counselors, and there are other positions besides QRPs, are public facing, and that they work with individuals in the public, whether that be in the office or in the community. And so that would be considered an essential function to be available to our consumers. We have individuals who have varying needs, varying abilities and resources. And so the ability to be available to our consumers to provide face-to-face work, we feel is really important. So that addresses kind of the essential functions. in terms of the quality or quantity standard, we've had requests not specific, and I'm going to give some generalizations, but not specific to QRPs, where individuals had asked if they could have reduced work. And what we say, that would be eliminating an essential function or to lower the quantity of work that a person is expected to do. An accommodation that we would want to put in place, for example, is while we can't eliminate the work, what we could do is, for example, provide you extra time. And that can be an accommodation so that the employee has the ability to meet the essential functions of their position, but to be able to have more time to be able to carry out the work. And you mentioned a couple things, so I hope I caught that all.
So if you don't mind, if I have a follow-up question. As a counselor, you work with ages anywhere from 16 to 22, and not everybody drives. So how are they going to meet in office? If you're saying that's an essential job duty to a counselor, how are they going to meet in office if they don't drive? Why is that an essential function?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and just to clarify, again, you mentioned 16 to 22-year-olds. The department actually serves individuals 16 and up. There are
Correct.
many
Sorry, that was
individuals.
just the students.
Okay. So there are many individuals like myself, I do not drive, but the expectation is that individuals will utilize their resources on how to get to work, whether that be something like using paratransit, public transit, using rideshare, carpool, having a friend or family member, to help support get them to work. If it is required that an individual must travel as part of their work, so for example, they work in the office, but they need to go out in the community, we definitely provide reasonable accommodations. That could be, and I mentioned this, the support of a support service assistant. So an individual who would help the individual by driving for them. So for example, meet them at the office and drive them if it's, you mentioned 16 to 22, so to the schools or colleges, or even other community organizations or partners that we work with. Not specific to DOR, that there are other individuals here who travel for work, and maybe a person with a disability, and again, providing travel support can be an accommodation. Maybe we don't have a driver, but for example, the department will pay for an Uber or Lyft to take them to their work destination. They will not pay. So if it's, I need to go, to meet individuals in the community, it's not for their commute. So a commute to and from work is very different than traveling for work. So just want to be clear on that.
Next question, you're saying that there's a minimum or a number that a counselor has to hit in order to be an essential. You keep coming around this word of a minimum number of duties, or are you considering that like a quota, if you will, of a number that they have to hit?
So my statement was not at all in relation to QRPs. I know that you represent our QRPs, but a generalization that we're saying that and it's not about quotas, but that an individual is responsible for carrying out the same workload that a colleague who doesn't have a disability performs. With accommodations, an individual is able to do the work that an individual without a disability. They may do it different, they may use different tools and techniques, but the expectation is that they will perform the same level of work. And that's what I mean by quality and quantity.
All right. Thank you, Rosa. I believe we are out of time for Rosa's segment. I appreciate your presentation, Rosa. It was very excellent. I appreciate your time being here. I don't know, Bobby, if you have any additional
No,
thoughts.
join you in thanking Rosa. I did ask her to come in and explain and demystify the perspective of reasonable accommodation, because there's so many misunderstanding where some of the complaints might have emanated from. So Rosa was helpful in presenting the perspective of what goes through an employer's mindset when they're considering this reasonable accommodation request. There's a lot of questions came forward. Before I let you go, Rosa, I have just one other question, and that is, this is more of a logistical issue. I know you mentioned during your presentation the focus of medical note, like you want, for some medical expert to justify or support the functional limitation of person seeking reasonable accommodation, I assume. Many of the state employees are insured through or receiving medical help through Kaiser. And Kaiser has this policy that they don't really like to support or provide documentation. Of course, it's provider by provider basis, but in general, they're not offering that kind of support. So what would an employee do in a scenario like that when their only provider, which is Kaiser in this case, is saying, hey, we have a policy, we're not going to get involved with this, we won't give you anything? What do you?
I just have to say, I have not experienced that. I do receive medical notes, recommendations, work restrictions from individuals who have Kaiser. So let's just say, I think, I'm trying to think if they wouldn't, I think that we would ask more questions, engage in the interactive process, ask multiple questions, and try to have a better understanding. I think what we're trying to understand is and verify the request that you are asking, needs to be clear to us. And we're asking additional information because we want to be sure that we have the needed information to make the evaluation. And especially when we have situations where the accommodation that's being requested is having an impact to business operationally.
Great.
Yeah, and I know there's lots of questions that I did not, get to. If somebody's, wants to jot them down, I don't know your form if, you bring the questions back, but
thank you for offering to do that. We will download all these questions that came in. There are hundreds of them. Many of them are quite lengthy, and we wouldn't have time to accommodate them all. So if it's okay with you, we'd like to forward that to you, because I also understand that you were slated to do a panel discussion and something came up, you're not able to do that. So we will just forward you these questions, and if you could respond back to us, we'll distribute it to the attendees of this particular meeting. Thank you, Rosa. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.